welcome to Wealthy, the Matriark podcast.
Thank you.
It's really nice to see you and nice to have you.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So, as you know, Matriark is all about creating wealth and well-being for women in all aspects of their lives. So today, we're going to go over your personal background, how you've been helping women thrive in their business, talk shop a little bit about retail and our salon, our upcoming salon, which I'm very excited about. And at the end, we're going to talk about money. Sounds good?
Money. Yes.
Money. All right. So let's get into it. Susan, what's your definition of well-being?
I think it's really about balance. For me, well-being is having a sense of peace within myself in terms of my physical body, my general health, feeling like my family is in good shape, is in balance. There isn't a big stressor in one direction or another. And ideally that the world is more in balance, but unfortunately that isn't always the case.
So let's talk about your personal background, because I wanted to know, where did you grow up? I know I met you in the Hamptons. I met you in my store, actually, in Sag Harbor. But where did you grow up?
I was born in Detroit and moved to a town called Fort Wayne, Indiana, which I refer to as Action City because it wasn't. And that's where I grew up all the way through high school. And so, we are part of a small Jewish community in the state of Indiana. And that was an unusual experience, something unique to really a handful of us at the time. And so I had an interesting upbringing, spent a lot of time in Chicago, and just loved going to the big city,
And when did you come to the East Coast?
I was able to move to New York about a year and a half after I graduated from college. So I went from Chicago, where I was working with a corporate public relations agency, to New York, where they were headquartered, and they were able to transfer me to their New York office so that I could go to NYU for a graduate degree. So in those years, the agency that I worked for had a 50% tuition reimbursement program for graduate schools that they approved. And this was a very unusual program at the time called Interactive Telecommunications at NYU. I was very interested in new media, which was the beginning of the internet. And it makes me sound like a dinosaur, but the whole idea of being able to communicate from point to point versus traditional, broadcast medium or bigger newspapers at the time, which were very much point to multi-point. I really understood early on the power of that. And I think it's because I was working in public relations versus in mass advertising. So one of the things at the time we did in public relations was really think about affinity interests and affinity groups, smaller, more niche, audiences and messaging. And that's what obviously we do now with with the internet and interactive media. So there was a program at NYU. Unfortunately, they approved the program, which traditionally they're sending people to get an MBA or maybe a master's in journalism at the time.
And so you were working in PR. And tell me a little bit of the trajectory, because you went from there and then you went to advertising. And then how did you end up doing then experiential retail and starting your company?
Right. Just for a minute, I'm going to digress and tell you that even though my family was in smaller cities and towns in Indiana, my grandmother was very sophisticated. She was an actor in Chicago and was college educated. And so she had a buyer in Chicago who would send her boxes of clothing, that he would select from department stores and designers. And as a really young girl, I remember sitting on the floor in her home in Decatur, Indiana, and watching her open these boxes and take out, these entire ensembles, everything, hats, gloves, capes, dresses, shoes. And I was just, I was mesmerized by it. But I sort of tucked it away. And, she also, would take me on an annual shopping trip, usually around my birthday. So there was that part of me that was sort of innate.
That's
And I,
fun.
yeah, and I think, I'd never thought about a career in fashion. I wasn't particularly identified as a creative person. I think I naturally had a little bit more of a business sensibility. And I really loved working in the advertising and public relations world. But when I got into the interactive side of it, I realized that at that time I was going to have to do something a little more entrepreneurial or look for smaller companies and organizations to work with in order to really dive into this world of interactive. So eventually I left the agency world. And one of the things that was bubbling up was the idea of interactive shopping. So I
Oh,
was able to participate early on in some of the interactive shopping trials that were going on, that the cable companies were funding, that the telecommunications companies were funding at the time. So I got to work with companies, actually with even Mickey Drexler at the Gap back in the day, because, they were super interested in what does this mean for us to have a kind of direct shopping experience, with customers who could possibly order through the television or order through their computers. And I think once I kind of stepped onto that boat and I was able to merge this idea of product presentation and merchandising with interactive media, that was it for me. And I think there was kind of no going back. And I didn't only, and I still don't only work with fashion companies and retail companies. I'm actually have a lot of interest, and over the years I've worked with a variety of brands. But I think how you come upon an area that brings together a lot of the things that you're interested in, the things that you're more naturally good at.
for
So
sure.
that's kind of what happened. Yeah.
And you launched Pop Up Summer, which recently you changed into Pop Up Seasons, which indicates a broader view or strategy. Just
Yeah.
share a little bit
Yeah.
what that is.
Well, the experiential retail business, pop-up summer really started at the spring after 9/11. So my 9/11 experience included not being able to live in our apartment, which was in Tribeca, and the closing of our children's schools at the time. And so we had a small beach house in the Hamptons at the time, and were able to go there for what we thought would be a couple of nights while Tribeca got sorted and we understood, what was going to be happening with the building and with the school. And what we found out was our building and the school were going to be closed indefinitely. That was going to take many, many months, maybe years, before we were going to be able to live there again. So that was a huge change. And we had to look into enrolling our children in new schools and trying to figure out how we were going to deal with our jobs. And I had this idea that pop-ups, this idea of a limited presentation of product, in a beautifully curated experiential way was starting to bubble up. So, in those years, it was still a very new concept. And I
You were
was, I
very
think
early. I think you
very
one of the
early. And I
first
think I was
ones. Yeah.
exposed to my first pop-up in London, especially within the restaurant scene. And I just thought it was so brilliant, because people were bypassing the traditional restaurants or stores in order to go to these more limited edition pop-ups. And so I thought, I'm going to try that here. And I thought the Hamptons was a good environment to do that in because people, I think, are very open to new concepts. They're interested. They're also interested in finding new brands. And, very often they have the ability to buy new products and services. So the other thing that was happening at the time culturally was people were experimenting with yoga and spinning. Both of those physical activities were relatively new in those years. And I think as a way of dealing with, the trauma and stress of 9/11, I also was getting into yoga and found spinning to just be like, this amazing endorphin high and just as
Mhm.
such a way to relieve stress. And So I was a dancer when I was young. I love good activewear and what I call fashion activewear. And so people would very often follow me out of these classes. I love what you're wearing. Where did you get that? And oh, and men would ask me too. I notice you do yoga. I want to do yoga. And I thought, okay, here's a need. People are really interested, but I wanted it to have a very fashion approach. And so I went about creating my first pop-up in the Hamptons, which was called Endorphin. After
I
that,
didn't know that.
yeah, after the endorphin high. And I ended up going into Naturopathica and taking over their retail space, which is still based in East Hampton. At the time, they had a yoga program. So they had regular yoga classes. And I thought, well, this is a great place to offer, a selection of core fitness wear and accessories. And I also went into a yoga and fitness class space that was shared by Exhale in Bridgehampton at the time.
Yeah.
So I was able to work with those founders as well. Really, really interesting female founders, both of them, at Naturopathica and at Exhale. And I became kind of the retail arm for those companies, Endorphin Retail.
It's so cool that you were so early on the pop-up scene, but also athleisure, all of those things that later, of course, Soul Cycle sort of blew up in the Hamptons. All of those things sort of bubbled up at the same time, and you were so early on it. It's pretty remarkable. But so then let's talk about the name. You changed the name from pop-up.
Oh, yeah, I did want to talk about it for a second. So it's actually Pop-Up Season, singular. And I did that because I started in the Hamptons in the summer, and I love the word summer. It makes me so happy. And, at the time, there was so much energy around the idea of pop-up, right? So pop-up summer really felt like me. I loved it. I had a round red logo with an exclamation point, and I would always write the name Pop-Up Summer with the exclamation point. Like, that's how excited I was about it. The energy was just flying out of me to create that brand. I had never created a brand for myself before, and it lasted 20 years, and at we're right around the 20-year mark, I thought, I'm working with brands all year long, activating winter, summer, spring, fall, not just in the Hamptons, but in Miami during Art Basel, in New York City in the wintertime, holidays. And also the work really has changed from operating multi-brand collectives, which is how I started, where I would come up with a theme and invite brands to participate, multiple brands around, that were cohesive. I would hire the salespeople, would do the marketing, and really make a financial investment in a space, to what I'm doing much more of now, which is individual consulting. So I spend way more time now working with individual brands and developing strategies with them for their activations. And whether that takes the form of retail pop-ups or partnerships where they can do workshops and activations, it's a much broader feel. And also, I'm wiser, more mature, obviously, in my business life and in my personal life.
Yeah, but isn't that a beautiful thing? I find that sometimes if we talk about branding, sometimes we get stuck with a brand and then we think that we have to be that brand or that person for the rest of our lives. And we, in fact, don't have to do that, and as a small business, you can always, well, even as a big business, you can always pivot in a way that it's more in line with who you are then, and you grow and you change, and so should your company and your name and all of those things. So that's great.
Exactly.
Thank you. That you can help brands in a broader way, because I think everybody needs help. I think that, as you know, because I've been in retail for so long, there's too many brands for very little distribution, or very little great distribution, I would say. And the brands, even the brands that are excellent, there's so much competition. It's so expensive, and everybody needs help one way or the other.
Right.
That's how I feel.
Absolutely. And also helping brands embrace technology is really interesting to me. And I've obviously, I've always had a background in new technology, and I think it's a really important tool. for
Mhm.
designers and brands,
Well,
because
let's go there then, because I was going to ask you a little later about AI. And what do you think about that? And how do you think that's going to change retail and the way that we interact with product?
yeah. Well, AI that we'll talk about, and the other important platform that brands are starting to embrace, but I think is only going to become more important is retail media. So,
Yes.
video shopping, TikTok,
Yes.
Instagram, all of those platforms,
Live shopping. Yeah.
live shopping, live stream shopping is really important. So, on the AI side, obviously as designers, it's a fabulous new tool because the more that, you tell AI tools, I think the more helpful they are to designers in terms of helping them see their vision play out much more quickly. I still believe that the ideas come, from within human beings, but that the variations and things can just happen a lot more quickly with AI. And I think on the information and education side, we're just starting to scratch the surface of what's going to be available to consumers. So I'm really excited about what's coming down the pipeline, in terms of
Yes.
search and merchandising. And I think that brands are missing an opportunity and probably missing sales,
Hmm.
um, if they haven't figured out a way to have some styles that can be customized,
Hmm.
for somebody's preferences. And size is part of that customization problem, but so is lifestyle. You know, I might be comfortable going to a black tie wedding in a sleeveless fitted dress,
Right.
but my best friend, might come from a culture that it's more appropriate for her to wear long sleeves. And yet, that same beautiful fitted dress isn't available in long sleeves. So why can't the designer make that available to her? You know,
Yes, for sure.
and it is starting to happen. There are certain tools and technology that offer customization. So I think that's something to look for in the future as well. Necklines, right? Hem lengths.
Oh, yeah. And so, in terms of your the pop-up summer experience from the things that you've done in the past, what was one of your most memorable activations that you've done in the past?
I think just, going back to the beginning, one of the very first multi brand collectives in the Hamptons was called the Hamptons Collective. And the thing that was so interesting about it was bringing together 12 or 14 brands, seeing, the reactions of people in the Hamptons to these high quality independent designers that had no even wholesale footprint in the area at all. And then learning how to program for the customer in the area. So it wasn't just about, figuring out the displays and working with, 12 not only designers, but 12 publicists, 12 attorneys, 12,
Oh my God.
everybody had their teams, merchandisers, but also really reaching into the community and, finding the independent beverage companies and, the sorbet makers and the beauty brands and the stylists and and it was just an amazing platform to have the real estate, the energy, and I think 99% of the people involved were women. You never knew who was going to walk in the door. We were one day, serving celebrities, the next day photographers were finding us. I think it was just an experience of energy and exploration. It was also interesting to see which ones were able to form a community in one summer, enough of a loyal customer that they were coming back more than once to purchase not inexpensive, items, to the point where those designers felt that they could open their own stores the next season. And to me, that was success. I think that,
Yes.
it's like if you're a good dentist, your patients have great teeth and they don't need you very often. And I feel like if you're, a good consultant, if you're a good mentor, then the people that you work with go on uh,
Yeah.
to the next level in their businesses, and that makes me feel good.
Yeah, and after all, I think all of these things are very much about like being a lab for different things when you can afford to do small activations and you can try new things, be bolder in certain aspects of the business and try new products, get feedback. I think it's great.
I picked up the phone early on when I started the pop up world and called the founder of Lululemon in Vancouver
Mm. Oh, wow.
because I needed a core fitness brand for the endorphin, retail activation. And I had ordered samples, from a lot of places. And I remember this really cute little cropped legging that they called the Boogie Pant. Um,
Mm.
with a little slit, on the calf so that you could really move in yoga. And I just loved it. I thought, wow, I've never seen a piece like this. But in those years, they were still really new and didn't have any retail stores. I think there was one maybe there was one in San Francisco. So they had a retail strategy eventually. But I said, you really need to sell to me. I'm doing a series of pop ups in the Hamptons, and I had no retail credentials. They're like, "Who are you? Where's your store? What is this? Why should I sell this to you?" And I literally had to put the order on my personal credit card because they really had no program for direct
Mm.
product for direct shipping. And I just felt like that was so exciting to introduce a brand like Lululemon really to the whole East Coast. And then when they were ready to open their own stores, they called and said, would you walk us through New York City? Where do you think we should be?
Mm.
Where are, and so that was a very interesting process of looking at both, the real hardcore retail numbers in terms of,
Yes.
what is the most valuable retail real estate and where's the community? Where are the top yoga studios? Where's the fitness community?
That's fun. I mean, I didn't know about Lululemon.
Yeah.
Um, People look at the Hamptons. I hear this a lot, and I think either they underestimate this area and they dismiss it as this very wealthy, frivolous resort town, and they don't like it, or they feel like it's this sort of like just like New York in certain ways, which is not. I think it's hard to explain, and I think it's nice that you can provide a service that can actually help people that want to be here because it's very expensive to be here. So you and I both, we love and respect creative and artists, and we work with them. And for those people that reach out to you as brands, or for those people in general now watching or listening that need help in these areas, especially women, what is your advice today in this day and age with this economy, with this level of pricing in the Hamptons and everywhere else? What should they do?
The first thing is to really be open, really be open minded about the possibility of partnerships and thinking about how to take their messaging and bring it to life. So I don't think that having a standalone store is the end all be all, for every brand. And, it's certainly a lot of fun. And, when you get to the point where, you can afford a lease and all the operations costs and really want to make a commitment to the staffing, that's a tremendous opportunity. And I love to do that as well. But I also think that identifying really strategic partners makes a lot of sense for a lot of brands and can go a long way. Because,
Yes.
going back to affinity groups, you know, a lot of successful brands, some that I've worked with, like Martha Stance, for example, which is a
Mhm.
primarily outerwear brand based in London, have been very strategic and smart about identifying their core customer, who their core customer is likely to be, and then
Yes.
really showing up for them, and really taking the time to create an environment where they can tell their story, allow people to experience the brand, but also listen and receive feedback. And that's a big part, I think, of these, shorter term activations. It's showing up is half the battle, right? I mean, it's
Yes. So, Susan, if you could have dinner with three creative women, living or dead, doesn't matter, who would they be and why?
off the top of my head. I've also always been fascinated by Helena Rubinstein, for example. I think that, her origin story, I mean, as a Jewish woman in the time that she started her business and, what she had to do to be a successful woman in, the beauty business, in her case, in New York, is just an incredibly interesting story. And I would love to sit down with her and,
That would be
hear
fun.
about that. Yeah, she would be brilliant. But there's just, I mean, where do you even start? There's so many, and Vivienne Westwood is another
Yeah.
person whose background, I think she must have just the best stories. That was obviously such a loss, but her sensibility, what she experienced would be so much fun, to hear about.
Um,
I would have dinner with Kim Kardashian. I think she's
what would you
fascinating.
ask her?
Well, I mean, again, you posted, I think today, a story about, women we love to hate. And why is that? Why do we hate successful women of color and women in general? And I think that she will continue to grow and be successful. Whether or not I agree with all of her choices, that isn't the issue. It's
Yeah.
where does that drive come from and that confidence? And I talk with people that I mentor and brands a lot about leaning into the things that you're excited about and that you're good at, even if society is telling you that that's not the thing to value. And I think that's one of those things that I wish I'd learned earlier on in life instead of spending so much time doing the things that I thought I was supposed to be doing. And I feel pretty lucky because I did follow my own course pretty early on. But it's something that for a lot of people it takes a lot of years to get to.
Let's talk about future then. What's next for you and for your company? We should definitely talk about the salon. Um,
Yeah.
but what's next for you and pop up season?
Yeah. So in terms of the business, we're in a phase that I call strategy season. So we're right at the heart of it, especially for brands that are looking at summer activations. So one of the companies that I'm excited about working with this season is called Niwaki, and they are a London-based company that imports and has makers in Japan of beautifully designed gardening tools and accessories.
So
Um,
great.
it's a beautiful brand.
Mhm.
The Niwaki founder is very focused on design, on quality, teaching people how to care for their tools, using high quality products for their leather goods, for example, which are the belts and the bags that hold the accessories. They also make beautiful Japanese cotton workwear, work jackets and
Mhm.
shirts. So, I don't want to talk too much about what we're going to be doing yet, but I'm very excited to be uh, working with them and with the things that they're experts at.
And we are getting together. It was sort of like kismet because we met at the shop. We've talked about other opportunities for pop-ups and things. And then as I was about literally a day before I was going to send an email to say that I was going to organize some salons, and I was just saying to people, I want to be doing this. You emailed me and saying, hey, wouldn't it be great to do some salons? And I'm like, well, I think this just meant to be, the timing couldn't have been more interesting, right?
I've been wanting to do it for over a year. I'm really thinking about it. I've reached out to some potential guest speakers, and I've been wanting to do it, with a partner. And I just woke up that morning and I thought of you. I just said,
Isn't that amazing?
and we really don't know each other that well yet. And I just
Yes,
thought,
right.
this just feels like it could be really interesting. I had no idea if you'd be interested in this. and, fired off an email, and you wrote right back and said, wow, this is so strange because I've been thinking about wanting to do this. So, yeah.
Yeah, and literally next day the newsletter went out to say those things. So I was like, okay, this is a sign I have to do something with Susan. And
Yeah.
I had so much respect for what you were doing already. But yeah, so I'm excited because we're working on a very interesting lineup of people that will come in into a private setting, and we're going to be chatting and having very intimate conversations with the audience. And it's supposed to be an intimate group because we're supposed to really connect with the guests and have an opportunity to really have real conversations. And I'm excited about that because I think we're all missing that piece in real life. True, authentic connection, not forced transactional things, because we all know how those things are, and we have plenty of those to go to.
Right.
Um,
Right. Right.
well, I'm excited for our salons, and I hope that people will be too. We will announce our lineup in time. So in the meantime, I think what I wanted to close this conversation with money. I think one of our important goals for Matriarch is to send as much money to women as possible. We started supporting women on businesses. We continue to that support through our newsletter and through salons and through any way we can do that. But we also feel like it's important to normalize talking about money. So I've been trying to ask our guests a few questions about it so we can normalize the discussion.
Thank
So
you
for
for doing
you,
that. First of all,
oh,
thank you. Thank you. No, more of us have to be talking about finance
I
and
think
money.
so
And
too.
yeah, yeah.
So when you were growing up, did you talk about money? Is it something money was discussed in the open in your family or no? How did that work for you?
Yes. So my grandparents, who lived closest to us, had a business together. So I saw my grandmother working, with my grandfather and making money and handling money. Um,
Mm.
so that was really interesting. So I was aware that, in addition to her being an amazing cook and an amazing mother and grandmother and glamorous, and throwing cocktail
Very
parties, she
glamorous.
also
Yeah.
worked. She went to work and she talked about it and hired people. And, so I got to see that firsthand. And my mother also worked. And I do feel like there was a lot of stress about money in the way that money was talked about in my home in terms of, you know, having to be careful, having to save, not taking a lot of trips, not doing certain things. So I think I was very fortunate. We had a nice life, but it wasn't a free for all, So, and I think the time that it really became most noticeable to me was around college. So realizing that, my parents, I have two younger brothers, were set up to send us to an in-state university. You know,
Hmm.
they valued higher education a lot, and financially, they were set up to send us to in-state school. I wanted to transfer to a private university in another state. And so they said, well, if you want to do that, here's how you apply for a student loan, and you can get a part-time job. And oh, okay, I really had to think about it, and I did make the decision to do that.
Hmm.
But it was, I think, my first, well, I always worked. I mean, I think as soon as I was 15 I started working in middle school and high school, and loved that. But when it became a real need to get to the end, you know it was around college
Understand.
years. Yeah.
So it's nice that you got exposure to a woman actually, talking about money early on.
Yeah.
Um, and so now, as an adult, are you a good negotiator? Like, do you have any tips for women? Whether you are good or not at negotiating, do you have tips for women and how to negotiate? Because I know you deal with so many brands and different people.
Yeah. I try to be. I do think that there are times when I, leave money on the table because I'm eager to close a project and to move forward, And I think there's that a little bit of that people pleasing that still plays into the negotiating factor, where, well, okay, if I'm close to what I think my time is worth, or, I'm willing to, finish a
Compromise.
negotiation. Yeah. But I think that it is, it's very important for me to feel good about the outcome, to feel like that's a successful negotiation. And I do value, my time. And I encourage, especially the younger entrepreneurs that I work with, to try to get what they feel they need and what they want at the beginning, because it's very hard to go back and ask for more. We know that, and this whole idea of the back end, there's very often, there's not often a back end, it just doesn't really work out that way. And so I think for a lot of people, they went, well, I didn't exactly get what I wanted up front, but I have a piece of the back end. And,
Yeah.
unfortunately, I mean, sometimes that works out. The other side of it is learning how to raise money. And, that's something that I was exposed to in the agency world. I was part of a team that took a company public, an interactive agency. And so I got to participate in some of those presentations, and then, have worked with founders who are raising money. And I still think that's challenging for women entrepreneurs. And it's really worth studying it if you need to raise money for your company, and reaching out to women investors, and getting that, mentorship and that personal advice. And I find that women investors usually very open to meeting with other women and guiding them around how to raise money.
The numbers are still pretty staggering how low, I think 2-3% of companies are female founder invested from VCs.
But something to keep in mind, depending on where you're at in the fundraising, but that, most investors are investing in the people. They're investing in you, and so I think if you don't undersell yourself, and you do a great job of presenting yourself, that it will go, better.
Yeah. Speaking of investments, if I gave you, Susan, today $1 billion and you could spend in one thing to solve a problem, what would you do? Only one thing.
Only one thing.
There are many problems in the world, but what would you choose to tackle first?
Yeah, I think women's education. I think ensuring that girls are educated around the world and understand that they have agency over their minds and their bodies, and helping them figure out how to give themselves the best possible opportunity and protection. Self-protection is number one.
I would invest with you on that one.
Great.
Thank you so much, Susan, for your time, your wisdom, your experience, for sharing everything you know, and just for spending time with me today. It was a treat.
I'm really looking forward to working together.
Yeah, it's going to be so fun. I am excited, and we're going to have a blast with the salons, and hopefully there will be more things we'll do, but we'll start with the salon. And
I know, I feel that bubbling up as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for participating and for everything that you do with me.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Wealthy, the Matriark podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, it would mean so much to me if you shared this with someone. Make sure to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and head to matriarch.com to stay connected. I'm your host, Patricia Asui Reed. Thank you so much for being here.